Quiet Guide to Surviving Money Anxiety. Tonight, on Bedtime Finance Stories, we step gently into a world many people know well. The quiet tension that rises when numbers feel heavy, when bills linger on the table, and when the mind holds more questions than answers. This episode is a soft companion for those moments, a slow narration meant to ease the weight that financial worries often place on the heart. Here, we move at an unhurried pace. We breathe through the pressure, noticing how the world outside grows still, how dusk settles like a calm blanket, how even the largest worries soften when viewed through a gentler lens. There is no rush in this space, no urgency, only the quiet awareness that you have survived difficult days before, and you're allowed to rest now, even if the journey is not yet finished. As we drift together through reflection, routine, and quiet resilience, allow each word to guide you slowly toward calm. Hey, now let us begin. Quiet Guide to Surviving Money Anxiety. The evening had settled quietly around the small apartment, the kind of evening where the world seemed to move at half its usual speed. The light from the single desk lamp spread softly across the wooden surface, touching the scattered bills, the half-filled notebook, and the faint outline of a calculator that had long passed its usefulness. For a moment, everything looked still, as if the objects themselves were tired of being part of financial worries. And perhaps, in a way, they were. The person sitting at the table, someone who had lived with money anxiety for so long that it had become a familiar companion, exhaled slowly. The breath drifted into the warm air like a small cloud. There were days when the sharpness of worry cut deeply, and there were other days when it was simply a dull ache, like a muted drum beating somewhere in the background. Tonight, the ache was the quieter kind. Still heavy, still present, but softened by the stillness of the room. They glanced again at the numbers on the page. Rent, utilities, groceries, a credit card bill that looked somehow larger than before, even though the charges were not new. The rising cost of everything had carved new shapes into their routines. Smaller meals, delayed repairs, the silent question of whether something less essential could be postponed for one more month. Money anxiety wasn't a sudden storm. It was a slow, persistent drizzle, the kind that soaked through layers of clothing before anyone realized it. But tonight, instead of rushing toward conclusions or spiraling into imagined futures, the person let the numbers sit quietly. They didn't argue with them. They didn't try to force solutions. They simply acknowledged their presence. That simple gesture, just sitting with the reality, was the beginning of something softer. Outside, a distant motorcycle passed. The sound was low and steady, a reminder that the world continued its motions regardless of personal worries. Street lights cast faint, amber reflections onto the window glass. Every detail seemed to slow time down just enough. They closed the notebook. Not out of avoidance, but out of intention. There was a limit to how much worry could be carried in a single evening. Instead, they traced their fingertips along the grain of the wooden table. An old piece of furniture passed down through a friend who no longer needed it. Its imperfections felt grounding. It had held many things: meals, conversations, tears, laughter, and now financial uncertainty. And it endured all of it. A small ritual formed. They stood up, walked to the kitchen, and poured a glass of water. The sound of the water hitting the cup was calming in its simplicity. Money anxiety often grew louder when everything else was quiet, but tonight they introduced new quietness of their own choosing. As they returned to the table, they noticed a thought rising gently, one that didn't blame, didn't criticize, didn't judge. It simply said, "You are doing what you can, and that is enough for this moment." The thought stayed with them, soft and steady, like a hand resting on their shoulder. For the first time that day, the person felt something loosen inside. A small release. a slow unwinding. They understood that money anxiety did not disappear by force. It eased through slow acceptance, through recognizing the reality without letting it swallow everything. And so they breathed again, long and quiet. Reflection. Even the heaviest numbers soften when faced with stillness. And sometimes, the first step toward calm is simply letting the moment be what it is. Morning arrived with muted sunlight slipping past the curtains, painting soft stripes across the floor. The apartment felt different in the early hours, lighter, almost forgiving. Money anxiety often felt sharpest in the morning, especially when tasks lined up like little reminders of everything that needed attention. But today, the person moved slowly, as if testing a new rhythm. They brewed a simple cup of coffee, breathing in the warm aroma. The routine felt grounding, almost ceremonial. There was nothing extravagant about it, yet in its simplicity, it carried a quiet dignity. Living within financial limits wasn't always about deprivation. Sometimes it was about finding small rituals that offered comfort without cost. They opened the refrigerator. The contents were modest: vegetables bought on discount, a pack of eggs, leftovers from the previous night. At another time in their life, perhaps these shelves would have felt insufficient. But now they looked at them with a different lens: practicality, resilience, intention. Each item represented effort, planning, and the quiet discipline of someone learning to navigate financial anxiety with steadiness rather than panic. Later that morning, they walked to a nearby market instead of taking transportation. The air was cool, and the pavement carried the familiar texture of a neighborhood they had lived in for years. Walking saved money, yes, but it also saved something intangible: mental fog, tension, the weight of urgency. With every step, the world felt quieter. At the market, they moved deliberately, selecting what was essential. They compared prices gently, not obsessively. They avoided impulsive decisions and chose items that stretched far, ingredients that could be transformed into several meals. Money anxiety could make small decisions feel monumental, but here, among the ordinary sounds of vendors and customers, things felt more manageable. On the walk home, they reflected on an old belief they once held, that financial stability required large, sweeping changes. But now they saw that survival, especially in difficult times, often depended on something quieter: steady habits, consistent choices, and acceptance of limits. Back at home, they spent part of the afternoon reviewing their expenses. Instead of seeing restrictions as failures, they began to view them as boundaries that shaped new forms of creativity. Cooking from scratch, repairing something instead of replacing it, using what was already available. There was a quiet strength in these adjustments, a resilience built not from abundance, but from intention. In the evening, they lit a small candle, another ritual. They weren't pretending things were easy. They were practicing gentleness in the midst of difficulty. Money anxiety could shrink the world, making everything feel urgent and overwhelming. But small, peaceful routines expanded the world again, even if only a little. As the day came to a close, they wrote a short line in their notebook. "Today I lived within my limits, and that is not a failure. It is a form of wisdom." The sentence felt true in a way that surprised them. Living within limits did not mean giving up. It meant finding new ways to move forward. And in that slow forward motion, a quiet resilience was forming. Reflection. Limits are not walls. They are gentle frames that help us move with more clarity. Within them, we often discover strength we didn't know we had. The third evening arrived with a soft drizzle outside, the sound tapping lightly against the window. Rain had a way of bringing old thoughts to the surface, especially those tied to money. Moments of overspending, regrets, unexpected emergencies, choices made during more optimistic times. Money anxiety often carried echoes of the past, faint reminders that blended with present concerns. The person sat near the window, listening. The rain's steady rhythm was calming, like a soft brush across the mind. They held their notebook again, not to calculate, but to understand. Anxiety made everything feel immediate, but not everything belonged to the present moment. Some worries were memories wearing today's clothes. They wrote slowly, "Where does this anxiety begin?" It wasn't a question looking for a perfect answer. It was an invitation to explore gently. They remembered nights spent staying awake, imagining worst-case scenarios. They remembered childhood moments when adults whispered about bills, rent, or unexpected expenses. They remembered times in their early adulthood when money mistakes were met with harsh self-judgment. Financial fear, they realized, didn't start with the numbers themselves. It started with meaning, with stories, with old interpretations of safety. Tonight, they allowed those memories to visit without overpowering the room. They listened to them the way they listen to the rain, calmly, steadily, with a bit of distance. Money anxiety grows louder when it feels unseen. But when observed with patience, it loses some of its sharpness. They traced a simple pattern in their notebook. Past, fear, projection, anxiety. It was a loop, repeating silently. Breaking the loop required a new interpretation, not optimism, just honesty. They wrote a new line. "I'm no longer the person who made those old decisions." The sentence felt grounding. As the rain continued, they remembered something important. Financial fear often exaggerates time. It makes the future feel dangerously close and the present feel unbearably fragile. But in reality, time still moves at its slow, steady pace. Bills come monthly. Income arrives periodically. Choices can be made gradually. They breathe deeply, feeling the difference between real urgency and imagined urgency. Not everything needed to be solved tonight. Not every worry deserved the same weight. The echoes grew softer. They looked around the room, the quiet table, the small plant near the window, the warm lamplight. These were simple things, but they were stable. Stability was sometimes overlooked because it wasn't dramatic. It didn't shout. It whispered. They whispered back, "I'm learning." Even if money anxiety returned tomorrow or next month or whenever life demanded more than expected, they would return too. Calmer, clearer, more aware. Understanding the echo didn't erase it, but it transformed it into something manageable, something that could be acknowledged without fear. Tonight, that was enough. Reflection. Anxiety often carries the voice of the past, but the present offers a quieter, steadier truth. Listening gently is the first way to soften the echo. The next morning unfolded without hurry. Sunlight touched the room in a muted glow, illuminating the edges of the furniture. The person woke with a softness in their chest, a feeling not of certainty, but of space. Money anxiety often compressed everything inward, but today there was room to breathe. They sat at the table with a cup of warm tea and opened their notebook again. But this time, instead of listing expenses or regrets, they began listing their islands of calm, small habits that had brought even brief moments of peace during financially stressful days. The list grew slowly, a quiet walk before sunset, preparing simple meals with intention, reviewing finances at a gentle pace, not in panic, naming worries out loud to reduce their pressure, lighting a candle in the evening, turning off unnecessary notifications, journaling the smallest achievements, resting without guilt. These were not solutions in the conventional sense. They didn't increase income or lower bills, but they transformed the emotional landscape in which financial decisions were made. When the inner world was calmer, everything else became more manageable. Later that day, they spent time adjusting their budget, not aggressively, not with desperation, but with clarity. They separated wants from needs, removed old subscriptions, and planned for small sinking funds, even if the amounts set aside were modest. Money anxiety wasn't just fear of lack, it was fear of losing control. Rebuilding a sense of control, even in tiny increments, felt like reclaiming lost ground. They created envelopes for different categories. Not physical envelopes, but digital ones. Rent, electricity, groceries, emergency repairs, debt payments, even a small comfort envelope for occasional treats. Budgeting had once felt suffocating, like a punishment, but now it felt like a map, something steady to hold on to. In the afternoon, they stepped outside and walked through the neighborhood. The world looked familiar, yet renewed. Children played in the distance, vendors arranged their goods, and older residents sat on benches, talking slowly. Life continued in its gentle rhythms. The person reflected on how easy it was to believe that financial calm came only from big milestones. Debt freedom, high income, significant savings. But walking through the streets, listening to the hum of daily life, they realized something quieter. Calm was built from moments, not milestones. A small island of calm could be as simple as cooking a meal without rushing, or taking 5 quiet breaths before opening a bill, or acknowledging effort before criticizing outcomes. These islands connected over time, forming a more stable inner landscape. In the evening, they practiced another ritual, reviewing the day and closing it intentionally. They acknowledged one worry that had been loud that day, named it, and then placed it aside. Not ignoring it, but scheduling time for it tomorrow. Anxiety feared structure. Calm embraced it. The night settled softly around them. They felt more grounded, not because problems had vanished, but because they were learning to stand steadily within them. That, in itself, was a form of progress. Reflection. Calm is not a destination. It's a collection of small islands we build through gentle routines. Over time, those islands become a place to rest, even during storms. The 5th day brought a quiet shift, an internal recognition that the relationship between a person and their finances was more emotional than numerical. Money anxiety often disguised itself as a math problem, but underneath, it carried deeper stories about worth, identity, and belonging. The person spent the morning reflecting on this truth. They had always believed that financial struggle reflected personal failure. But now, sitting on the edge of their bed with sunlight warming the blanket, they began questioning that belief with tenderness. Many people struggled financially, not because they lacked discipline or intelligence, but because the world had shifted. Rising living costs, stagnant wages, unexpected emergencies, economic cycles beyond individual control. No single person caused these conditions, yet so many blamed themselves quietly. They realized they were one of them. With a slow breath, they wrote in their notebook, "My value is not a number." At first, the sentence felt unfamiliar, almost foreign, but as they repeated it silently, something softened inside. They remembered moments when small financial setbacks felt like complete failures. Times when they avoided friends out of embarrassment. Times when they stayed silent in conversations about money. Times when they believed they weren't progressing fast enough compared to others. Anxiety had linked self-worth to financial status, tying identity to circumstances. But identity was larger, quieter, deeper. They spent part of the day revisiting old skills and strengths, creativity, patience, adaptability, empathy. These qualities had helped them survive difficult times more than money ever had. They recognized the countless invisible ways they had shown resilience, canceling plans to save money, finding joy in low-cost moments, navigating uncertainty with steady breaths. In the afternoon, they cleaned their living space. Not as an escape, but as a way to reshape their environment. With each object they put away, they felt a small symbolic shift, an external reflection of the internal work they were doing. A tidy space didn't solve financial issues, but it made room for clarity. Later, they cooked a simple dinner. As they stirred the pan, they realized how often they overlooked their own efforts. Every day they made choices that balanced survival and hope. This labor, quiet, unseen, daily, was worth acknowledging. After dinner, they sat near the window again, watching the changing colors of the sky. Money anxiety often thrived on comparison, feeding off imagined standards. But here, alone with the sky's slow transformation, comparisons felt irrelevant. Life moved on its own timeline. They whispered to themselves, "I am more than this moment." For the first time, they felt a subtle separation between their identity and their financial situation. They were not the problem. They were the person navigating it. And that distinction mattered deeply. As night arrived, they wrapped themselves in a blanket and allowed a sense of gentleness to settle in. Their worth had always been intact, even in moments when they doubted it. Reflection. Your financial situation may shift, rise, or fall, but your worth remains steady. You are more than the numbers you carry. The final day of this quiet journey began with a cool breeze entering through the slightly open window. The sky was pale and soft, the kind of morning that invited slow reflection. The person sat once more at the wooden table, the familiar setting where worries often gathered, but today it felt different, almost like meeting an old companion with new understanding. They opened their notebook, flipping through the pages filled over the past days. Reflections, worries, small victories, reminders of self-worth, gentle rituals of calm. Each page told a story, not of sudden transformation, but of steady, deliberate change. Money anxiety had not disappeared, but its edges were no longer as sharp. They reviewed their current financial picture with steady breaths. The numbers were the same, but the way they approached them had shifted. They had built new budgeting habits, gained awareness of emotional triggers, and created routines that offered stability. They understood that financial progress was a series of quiet steps, not leaps. Throughout the morning, they organized their upcoming expenses, assigning each amount to its category. They made space for the unexpected by allocating tiny amounts into an emergency fund. Even if small, it represented preparation. They scheduled a specific day each week for financial review, preventing anxiety from appearing unpredictably. They created a checklist for slow improvements, such as comparing utility plans, exploring small freelance work, or reducing unnecessary spending one item at a time. Afterward, they stepped outside for a walk. Money anxiety used to make the world feel smaller, but now the streets felt open again. The trees stood steady, unaffected by economic uncertainties. The air moved freely. People went about their routines. Life carried on, and they were part of it. Not weighed down by fear, but quietly moving forward. As they walked, they remembered past periods of financial crisis. Times when everything felt impossible. Yet they survived those moments, even when they didn't know how. That memory alone was proof of resilience. They returned home and prepared a simple dinner, taking time to enjoy the small satisfaction of creating something nurturing. Financial calm didn't require abundance. It required presence. In the evening, they wrote one final entry in their notebook. "Tomorrow is uncertain, but I am learning to meet it slowly. My worth is steady. My choices are deliberate. My anxiety is not my identity, and I am moving forward." The night grew quiet. They felt the weight of responsibility, yes, but not the paralysis of fear. They felt the reality of their financial limitations, yes, but also the truth of their ability to adapt, adjust, and keep going. The journey ahead would not be perfect. There would be unexpected expenses, stressful moments, rising costs, and days when anxiety returned with familiar intensity. But now they were equipped with gentler responses, rituals of calm, acceptance of limits, clarity of thought, and a deeper sense of self-worth. They prepared for sleep. lying down with the soft hum of the room surrounding them. The financial world outside continued its complex rhythms. Markets shifted, prices fluctuated, policies changed, but within this small space, there was peace, a steady peace, earned through quiet reflection and patient self-understanding. And as their eyes grew heavy, they realized something simple yet profound. Survival was not just about income or expenses. It was about the ability to remain gentle with oneself through every wave of uncertainty. Reflection. Tomorrow will come with its own questions, but you will meet them with steady breath and quiet strength. You are no longer walking through anxiety alone. You are walking with understanding. In the stillness that follows the long journey through worry and reflection, the room feels softer, almost warm with understanding. The numbers remain, the responsibilities remain, and tomorrow will bring its own rhythms. But tonight, the mind settles gently, wrapped in the quiet truth that survival is built one calm moment at a time. Nothing grand is required. No sudden breakthroughs. No perfect plans. Only steady breath, small kindness toward oneself, and the slow willingness to keep moving forward. As the night deepens, the weight of the day loosens. The world outside fades into a distant hum, and in this quiet space, a simple realization lingers softly. You have done enough for today, and tomorrow can wait.